Okay, we are live. Very exciting. I always feel like I never know what to say at the beginning of the live, but here we are. We're on a live together with Sarah, and the reason that we're here is, of course, to talk all about Austen. Very specifically. Very specifically, this time we want to be talking about Northanger Abbey by Jane Austen. So this is, for anyone who might be new to the situation, the fifth book that was published by Jane Austen, and therefore the fifth month of the All About Austen Readalong, which I have been hosting, reading Jane Austen's books in publication order. So very, very exciting. I am super looking forward to diving into this one because I feel like it's quite a unique Jane Austen novel. I feel like this one stands out to me compared to some of her other books because I think it's got a very different style, in the sense that it's like very much a satire. But we'll dive into that in a little bit. But as a few people file into the live show, I always like to kickstart these live shows just by talking a little bit more generally about Jane Austen. So I personally like to always know how many of Jane Austen's novels you've read, and where this one sits in your ranking of them, and also if this one's not your favourite, which one it is.
Is that my cue?
That's for you, yeah.
Sorry. So I've read Pride and Prejudice. Well, I'll say them in the order of my ranking.
Yeah.
Emma, I put as number one.
As in your favourite or
my
your least favourite? Oh, really?
I've changed. Since reading this, I've done a switcheroo.
Oh, my.
I can't remember what I said last time.
Doesn't matter about that. Just go with what your heart says today.
Emma, Sense and Sensibility, Pride and Prejudice, and then Northanger Abbey. So I haven't read Mansfield Park and I haven't read Persuasion.
Okay, so that's interesting.
I think that's switched because I think Pride and Prejudice was above Sense and Sensibility last time.
And Emma was
third.
Low down, so you've had a real change of heart.
I really have. You know what it is? It's the film.
It's the film does a lot.
The film made me appreciate the book more.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so we have a Pride and Prejudice fan. To be expected because it is a great book. Hi to everyone. Obviously, would love to know anyone else's favourite Jane Austen, or if you have like a standout least favourite. I find that really interesting to hear as well. For me personally, I can now say I have read all of Jane Austen's novels. When I went into this read along, I had read them all except for Mansfield Park, which I of course read earlier this year, and now I've read Northanger Abbey again as a reread, and this was the one that I remembered the least about of all of the ones that I have read previously, and that's because it was the first ever Jane Austen novel that I ever read, so it was quite a long time ago that I read it, and I didn't remember a huge amount, so I kind of went into it with fresh eyes, and I think it might be my second favourite.
Oh,
so as it currently stands, ranking from favourite to least favourite would go Emma is favourite, then Northanger Abbey, then Pride and Prejudice, Sense and Sensibility, Persuasion, and Mansfield Park as my least favourite. So it's always like the top spot has been firmly held by Emma since the very day that I opened the first page, but the other positions, I feel like favourite is solid and least favourite is solid, and then in between it shifts around depending on like what I fancy that point, or like how I feel about it with each read. That's very interesting. I feel like Persuasion is also quite a like unique novel in the way that it is sort of like the way that it unfolds, and obviously this isn't the Persuasion live show, we will be talking about that more next month, but I do think it is quite an interesting read. I read it at university, so I'm interested to read it again with more of a like leisurely attitude. Yeah, so it was for a 18th, no, not 18th century, I think it might have been Romantic literature or Victorian, or it wasn't Victorian. I was going to say 18th century, but it wasn't. It can't have been 18th century because it must have been 19th century. I didn't do a 19th century literature module, so I don't know what I read it for, but I read it at university is the main thing. Okay, so Sensibility, love that. And Emma is a close second. We love to see it. Northanger Abbey is my favourite. Amazing. Well, that's interesting. Would love to hear more about your thoughts there. Ooh. See, I think you can be, personally, I mean, I do love Emma as a protagonist because I think she has a lot of growth throughout the novel, and she goes from being someone who could be quite unlikable to someone who has like a lot more awareness of their impact on other people, and I liked seeing that growth. But I do think you could like the book without necessarily liking her as a character, but that's just me. Good evening, and Persuasion, Emma, and Pride and Prejudice. Nice. Okay, amazing. We love to hear it. I just think it's so fun to hear everyone's thoughts on them. And also, like, feel free to share any reasonings as well, because I do think it's quite a personal thing. Jane Austen has, like, her very, like, distinct style, and a lot of her books, they are fairly predictable, and you know they're romances with a bit of social commentary, so they're not like the most complicated of novels, but I feel like there are little bits in each one and little sort of character quirks that can sort of make them appeal to one person over another, or maybe like that you see yourself in the protagonist that makes people like it more.
Yeah,
like
I'd say that with sensibility. I really liked Eleanor in that one.
Yeah, and I think I love Emma because I think I can be a bit judgmental, and like I'm a nice person, I promise, but also like I think it's natural that we do have like prejudices and judgments, and like, you know, sometimes you just don't like someone just because, and there's no real reason for it. And I think I could relate to Emma in that sense, whereas Fanny Price from Mansfield Park, I felt like she's obviously quite introverted and like very, very, very moral, and for me I felt like that was like a bit boring, and I didn't particularly find myself like relating to her. Whereas other people in the live show of that one, and also my vlog where I talked about it, kind of said that because they were like more introspected and quiet and sort of like understated as people, they could really relate to her. So I do think it's fun to hear like why people like certain characters.
When you mentioned judgment just then, you reminded me of the time that you judged those people in the park with their pick.
Okay, a little bit of context here. So I'm not above judging people, and I also do think that judging someone in like a passing way, when you're not ever gonna like try and upset someone or like say something to someone else and you're just making a funny comment, I don't think there's anything bad about that, because I think you can make your own funny little comment to your friends without causing any hurt to someone who you don't know and will never know, and they can live their life and you can live yours, and it's all fine. So basically, me and Sarah and our other friend Em were in a park, and this family had brought a picnic, but like they hadn't made the sandwiches in advance, so they had a tub of butter with them, and they were like buttering their sandwiches in the park, and I just thought, like, they were saying, Sarah and Em were trying to defend it by saying, oh well, of course we want to, like, they might want to like prepare as families to, you know, like have more time in the park, and they don't want to like have to go and buy food and everything, which is all fine. However, if you're going to try and prep in advance, make the sandwiches at home. Like, I got a little bit of the ick from seeing them.
There was a lot of kitchen items.
It's like it was a lot, and it was too much.
It was just the way you said it. It was just so off the cuff, because we weren't even talking about it. I don't think Em and I had even noticed it happening. It was so quick off the mark, and it was just so funny.
I am quite an observant person, and I struggle to be I like really cannot just exist as my own person. I like have always, from the time that I was like a very small child, would like be looking at people, listening to conversations, embarrassing my mum by like staring at people, because I'm so engrossed in what's going on around me. And I think that's why I love books so much, because you get to be nosy without embarrassing yourself. But I still do embarrass myself just by staring at people, and other people can just live on their own, as in like in their own universe, and not pay attention to what's going on around them. And I, for one, cannot relate. But anyway, so That's interesting. Yeah, I feel like that is a fair point about Emma because she is so comfortable financially, and she does stand out against all of the other Austen protagonists in that sense, where marriage is not a necessity for her. But I do think that offers an interesting insight into privilege, which is, I think, what Austen was maybe trying to do there, because Emma was so unaware of her own level of privilege that she kind of potentially messed up marriage prospects for a friend of hers who was far less comfortable financially. And I think it was interesting to see how Emma had that like growth of awareness throughout. So maybe that was what Austen was trying to do there. But I do agree it is slightly different because she doesn't have to get married. But I do like that that offers a different perspective as opposed to some of her other novels. So yeah, okay. I don't know anything about this book, just to clarify, but I'm not opposed to it by any means. I just don't know anything about it. Okay, so obviously, as per usual, if you have any questions to leave us throughout the live show or anything you'd like us to talk about that is in any way remotely Jane Austen related, then do leave them in the chat. But I think right now we'll start diving into the actual book that we're supposed to be talking about. So let's talk Northanger Abbey. To give a little bit of premise for anyone who might not know a huge amount about this book, if you're joining us and you haven't read it, in this book we have a main character, Catherine Morland, who is a young lady. She's just 18 years old, and she is from like a very normal family. They're neither rich nor super poor, but they have quite a lot of kids, and they don't have like massive prospects, but also they're not like destitute. And Catherine gets the opportunity to go off with some family friends to spend a season in Bath and kind of be introduced into society, and she is thrilled by this because she is a lover of literature and she loves this idea of like romantic prospects and being out there in society, and of course, as we see in every Jane Austen novel, potentially finding herself a future suitor or husband. So that is kind of where the novel kicks off. But the first thing I'd like to talk about is the opening line, which introduces our main character in quite a brutal way. And I think it sets the tone for the rest of the novel. And Jane Austen clearly had like a bit of a bee in her bonnet when she was writing this one, because she is kind of like rude about a lot of the characters. So
she's really blunt sometimes, because wasn't there another character where she described as just essentially inadequate?
I'm sure there was, yeah.
Which was quite brutal.
So first of all, we have the introduction to Catherine, and it says, "No one who had ever seen Catherine Morland in her infancy would have supposed her to be born a heroine. Her situation in life, the character of her father and mother, her own person and disposition were all equally against her." Is that, or is that not, like a really harsh way to introduce your own protagonist? Like
yeah, it's basically like this character's just a bit of a letdown, really.
And immediately she sets, like, I think it just sets the tone of satire for the novel, because it's like, obviously, Jane Austen does view this character as being worthy of being a protagonist, because otherwise she wouldn't have written the novel about her. But she's kind of like setting that like sort of satirical tone right from the beginning, which I personally think is interesting.
Really should have got it from that, shouldn't I?
Maybe.
From the first.
Quite possibly, but that's okay.
Definitely the first chapter.
And then we obviously, as I mentioned, said that Jane Austen says, no, not Jane Austen, says Catherine, our main character, goes off to Bath with some family friends, and the lady that is sort of like monitoring her is Mrs. Allen, and she is introduced just a few pages into the novel in the most brutal way. Like, it's actually so horrible, because she says, "Mrs. Allen was one of that numerous class of females whose society can raise no other emotion than surprise at there being any men in the world who could like them well enough to marry them." And then that's followed up by saying that she had neither beauty, genius, accomplishment, or manner. And I'm like, wow, she's really like, she's got a very scathing tone for this novel.
Well, there's a bit here where she says at 15 appearances were mending.
But then she follows that up by saying something along the lines of a girl who was once plain being described as almost pretty is better than a girl who's been a beauty her whole life.
Yeah.
So even those compliments about Catherine are kind of like backhanded compliments. And obviously, I think what it really aims to do is kind of like, as I mentioned, that Catherine's family was neither rich nor poor. You know, there was nothing terrible about them, but they were also not really noteworthy. I think that's where she's trying to put our protagonist as just very, very normal. Like, not someone of note, not someone that you could stop and stare at because they're so beautiful, but equally not someone who's like so horrifically ugly that they'd also cause like shock. It was just kind of like placing her right in the middle of society as just a normal young lady, but someone who, despite being very normal to all, you know, external view, was able to view herself as like a main character. And I guess, obviously, anyone who has been a TikTok user would know there's like a current like, what's the word, trend about being that girl, and then there's also the romanticize your life thing, and there's also like be the main character of your own story. And I feel like Catherine is the original person for that. Like, she is, you know, just a normal gal, but she is like absolutely trying to live her best life, and whether anyone else sees it or not, she's making sure to be the main character of her own story. And I love it. I do. So I immediately, this time around with my reread of it, loved that introduction because I just sorry. I just absolutely loved it because I immediately was able to recognise like how Jane Austen was tackling this one, and like the humour that she was bringing into it, which I think is really, really good. Okay, so yeah, I do think the introduction, it's like, okay, she's writing a book about the character, so she obviously likes her, but she's being a bit brutal, and I think that just sets a really humorous tone for me, and I personally really liked it.
I was just really clueless, to be honest. Looking back on it now, I think it's pretty obvious. There is satire. I, however, did not know that, so I'm altering my review as such.
Yeah, I do think though, like, when I read it the first time around when I was younger, I expected the book to be more of a Gothic novel because that was kind of the way that I had been sold it, or it was kind of like it's thrown into the Gothic genre in a way that I now realise is to be a satire of it. But at the time, I wasn't aware of that, and I think if you went into it expecting it to be a Gothic novel, and then it was obviously a satire of such a genre, it's quite a shock. Whereas I think when you go in with the awareness that it's going to be satirical, then you appreciate it more.
I think I'm going to have to reread this.
Luckily, it is her shortest novel, so in terms of like tackling a reread, it's not the most like, it's not an unachievable thing. It's not like taking on Middlemarch or something like, oh god, I missed that, I should have to go back and reread it.
I feel like when I read Middlemarch, that it will be read and then
never again.
It will be put down.
Yeah,
just because of its chunkiness.
Absolutely. I haven't had a chance to watch the movie because, quite honestly, me and Sarah only just finished reading this weekend, and that means I haven't had a chance to watch it yet. But I absolutely do want to watch the film. I want to know who's in it. I might just quickly Google it.
I watched the trailer.
Do you know who the actress is?
No. I think there's two versions.
Northanger Abbey movie.
I think there's two versions of every.
It's got what's her face in it. Felicity Jones.
What's she in it?
She was in Star Wars Rogue One, and then she was also in the Theory of Everything, the Stephen Hawking film.
Oh, yeah.
She was his wife in that. Okay, that's interesting. So yeah, I do want to watch the film, for sure. So I think the Gothic vibes, let's start talking about the Gothic, because I mean, in general, I think the Gothic is a word that is maybe like thrown around quite freely when actually it's supposed to refer to a very specific genre of books. But in this one, obviously Jane Austen was writing at a time when the Gothic was like at its peak, and there was Gothic novels coming out of every single author. That's a bit of a dramatization, but you know what I mean. There was like a lot of Gothic novels. And I think Jane Austen was like, these Gothic novels trying to be so serious, I'm going to show them what for, and kind of like play on some of their tropes, but also make fun of it. And by having a main character who is a young girl who loves the Gothic, I feel like she was able to kind of like show how it is, just like how it can get taken out of context a little bit. And I think it was a really fun way to play with that genre. But I think I missed that when I read it the first time.
Yeah, because my blurb, my synopsis, whatever you call it on the back of the book, does not portray it as satire. Like, it openly talks about it being a Gothic novel. It's called Northanger Abbey.
Mm-hmm.
You obviously think, I think Jane Austen clearly did a very good job of reflecting the fact that it's supposed to be around the Gothic genre. It's supposed to have some form of connection to Gothic literature.
Mm-hmm.
However, what I completely missed is the fact that it is epistolic.
Yeah.
So we can't have it all, really.
No.
And I think the fact that I didn't know that, I think I read it completely differently than what I was supposed to read it as. And it wasn't until my boyfriend pointed it out to me and he was explaining the connection to that book that she reads.
Udolpho.
Yeah, which is by, I think it's Anne Radcliffe.
I think so, yeah.
And he was explaining all the connections to that. I thought, wow, I've missed the plot entirely here.
Yeah, I do think, though, this comment here speaks to me because regarding rereads, I've loved every Jane Austen book more every time I've reread one. I think that's so true, and maybe more so for Jane Austen than any other author, because there are two of her books that I've loved reading the first time around, and those were Emma and Sense and Sensibility. I loved them immediately, whereas Pride and Prejudice, I didn't really care for the first time around. Then I reread it and I was like, oh my god, I'm really sensing the humour and I can just like get it. This one I liked, but clearly didn't make a huge impression on me because I didn't remember hardly anything about it until I went and reread it, and then it kind of came back to me a bit. But I really appreciated it more this time around. Mansfield Park I didn't really like, and that was my first time reading it. And then Persuasion, I'm interested to see whether my opinion of that changes now that I'll be rereading it, because I do just think you read the first time to kind of like understand the plot, or like, you know, you introduce yourself to the characters and you kind of follow the story. Then the second time around, I think, is when the humor, the nuances, the little hints that she makes about characters, and also like the social commentary and the way that she uses her humor to achieve that commentary is so much more obvious the second time around, for me at least.
I mean, when I read Emma the first time, I hated it. Like, I thought Emma, the character, was annoying, and I just didn't see the point of it. Reread it, and it's now up there.
Absolutely. Okay, I'm doing a study of the Gothic genre for school. What do you recommend? Picture of Dorian Gray is wonderful. Dracula, I love. That was like the first proper Gothic novel that I ever read. Wuthering Heights, I think, is amazing. People would say Jane Eyre kind of fits in the Gothic genre a little bit, and I think the Brontes in general are like, you know, very prolific in the Gothic genre. My favourite Gothic text, and I studied this when I was doing the Gothic module in my second year of A-levels, was Frankenstein by Mary Shelley, which was just wonderful. And then we also read two not medieval, but kind of like old-timey plays. One was Macbeth by Shakespeare, which is obviously not Gothic in terms of it was published far before the Gothic genre is officially like considered to have started, but it has a lot of Gothic tropes. And then similarly, there was one called The Changeling by, I believe, Thomas Middleton. So those were all kind of ones that I studied for Gothic literature at school. I don't know if you've got any other recommendations.
I'm trying to think, because I feel like Angela Carter But I don't know if she's
Oh yeah, the Bloody Chamber.
But I don't know if that's. I'm not sure on my dates for that one.
Yeah.
Maybe Tenant of Wildfell Hall and Agnes
Right.
Grey, along with Anne Bronte. She was more.
What have I got on my shelves? Yeah, I feel like those are probably.
Christina Rossetti's quite.
Yeah, Frankenstein, I think, is the best one. I don't know, Nella, if you mean, is Frankenstein anything like Dracula? I'm not sure, but if so, kind of, but kind of not. Frankenstein takes like a very like different writing style in the sense that you like learn the story of Frankenstein and his creature through like several different perspectives. So we meet this guy who has nothing to do with the story at all, but he meets Victor Frankenstein and he is telling the story to his sister. And then we learn Frankenstein's story, and then at the very center we hear the creature story, and it's a very like layered discussion of like what it means to be, you know, like morality in humans, basically. I'm really confused about the comment because you said I've read Dracula. Is it anything like it? Is what do you want to know if it's what do you want to know if something is like Dracula? Sorry, I feel like I'm missing the point. Okay.
Oh, but Angela Carter is Gothic.
Yes, it is. It is.
Smashing it.
Nice.
I didn't do Gothic for my A level. I did pastoral.
Ah, sucks to be you.
William Blake. She stoops to conquer.
I can't remember what poets I studied for Gothic literature. You know, really can't.
I did Christina Rossetti. That wasn't for the pastoral. That was just for.
Okay, right. No, I'm afraid I haven't read Udolpho, but I do believe that Udolpho is considered to be the original Gothic novel. So I think anything that followed after it will have followed tropes, and like some of the main themes that come out of like the Gothic literature are the setting of like these like magnificent houses and castles and all of those kinds of things, and all that sort of stuff. So
can confirm it was the first one, as told by an Oxford student. So it was the first one. And I think that's why she used it as inspiration for the Gothic genre. Because I think even though it was the first one, I don't think there was a huge, like straight away, influx of Gothic literature. I think there was a slight gap. Yeah, I may be wrong on that one.
Okay, so back to Northanger Abbey because we definitely have to talk about. But I do think it's important to kind of think about what the Gothic is to then understand what this book is trying to do, because we have a comment here which says it's not really about the Gothic but about a very dreamy lady who wants to discover adventure around every corner, which I think is true, but her desire to do that is influenced by her reading of Gothic literature. And I think what Jane Austen does is she uses her protagonist as a vessel to kind of explore the like folly of the Gothic genre. So she kind of like looks at like how extreme it can be, and how like the settings and the characters and the judgments that characters make of each other, and also the like extreme views on morality are like a bit much. And she uses her protagonist and how caught up she gets in her novels, and how she almost like sees herself as living in that fictional world, to kind of like make fun of the Gothic. And I think it is just a bit of fun. I don't think it was like a serious critique. I think she just kind of wanted to show.
Yeah, I think if it was a serious critique, she would have gone a lot harsher, whereas it's more kind of like, especially when Catherine goes to Northanger Abbey and it's not what she initially anticipates. It's more kind of like, look at how silly Catherine was to think it was going to be like this.
Yeah. And I think possibly, and I'm just making assumptions here, and obviously, unfortunately, I can't ask Jane because she is dead, but I know. What I wonder is that Jane Austen was a writer of romances. You know, at their core, her books are romances. And I wonder if, like, to the external view, and maybe at the time of publication and writing, maybe that, like, people would have seen her books as somehow, like, less than Gothic novels, because maybe her books are simply just trying to provide amusement and make a little bit of social commentary, whereas Gothic novels try to be a lot more like elevated and perhaps like were viewed with more prestige. And I think what she was trying to do was show that actually, despite her being like a silly romance author, she could see that there were some silly things in those Gothic novels, and she was just trying to like knock them down a peg or two and kind of like dismantle literary elitism. I think is something that you could take out of that. So anyway, okay. Oh yes, Castle of Otranto was the first one, but Adolfo is the first one by a woman. I knew it was the first something, but yeah. Okay. Absolutely agree here. I do think Jane Austen is such a great introduction to classics because they are fairly accessible. Generally speaking, not too long and just like fun to read. So yeah.
And I think even though the humour is obviously different, there are still parts where you can find them amusing. Whereas I think with certain other ones, it's a lot harder to understand.
Yeah, absolutely. Oh, that's fun. So she's doing pastoral for her actual A level and then Gothic for extended project. Love that. You're getting the best of both. 100% support. I feel like at the time I was really glad to be doing Gothic literature because I definitely was more drawn to that. But equally, I do think I probably would have enjoyed the pastoral as well. So
I will give it to William Blake. I did enjoy Songs of Innocence and Experience because the Songs of Experience was kind of, it did have some Gothic elements in it, I'd say, and about how the destruction of the beautiful land and everything like that. So you had the comparison there. So I would say that was quite interesting.
What novels did you do?
God, what did I do? This was A2, wasn't it? Yeah. I'm gonna have to think. What did I do?
So sorry.
She Stoops to Conquer, that was the play.
Because there was like Thomas Hardy was on the list.
Didn't do Thomas Hardy. What did I do? How have I forgotten? It wasn't that long ago. Because I get them mixed up with the ASs.
I'm just joking on my team. So.
What did I read? I wrote essays on this stuff.
In AS.
Oh, Brideshead Revisited.
Oh, Evelyn. Wow.
Yeah, really love that. Secret History is a poor imitation, in my opinion. I'm just saying, once you've read Brideshead Revisited,
bold of a statement.
Then you read the Secret History.
I don't think I did Gatsby in year 12.
Oh, I did Gatsby.
And also Enduring Love by Ian McEwan.
I did Birdsong, Sebastian Fox.
And then we did what's his face? Alfred Tennyson.
I did Rime of the Ancient Mariner.
And Abigail's Party I read as a play.
I remember the other one. God, it really wasn't that long ago.
I mean, it was quite a long, it was like 8 years ago.
We don't need to hash that out.
Just putting it out
8
there.
Years ago.
Oh, sorry, I'm just getting so interested in this syllabus.
Oh, my friend did Kite Runner.
Love that. Yeah, Handmaid's Tale is just incredible. I don't know if you've read it yet or if you're still yet to read it, but it is amazing. I did my dissertation on The Handmaid's Tale when I was at uni. So yeah, okay. I love this question. Okay, so who was your least favourite character in Northanger? And I'm just going to extend that and say favourite and least favourite. And if you would like to leave that in the comments as well, I'd love to hear everyone else's. Any thoughts? Or do you want me to
go? I'll do least favourite first, and then you can do least favourite. John. Just a nasty person, you know. He is the start of everything that is wrong with how you speak to people. Like, there were so many points when I just thought, why are you being such a nasty person? Like, you're trying to woo this woman to get her to marry you.
Mhm.
And he's so deluded. And then he goes off and he's like, oh, Catherine's in love with me. How?
Mia.
Yeah, exactly.
Honestly,
Exactly.
though, he is awful. Like, he truly is terrible. So I'm also in the team I hate John, because he is just honestly terrible, but also has such poor understanding for not only how humans work, but specifically how to woo a romantic partner. And the key to that is to not just simply ignore everything that they say they want to do or don't want to do and just take it upon yourself to do it for them instead, but also, like, yeah, just the manipulation. It's like he has no idea how the human mind works, and like he thinks he can just basically like bulldoze her into marriage essentially. And he's like, if he's like persistent enough, it'll just happen. And I think he also, and so does his sister actually, Isabella, I think they view
It's not fair either.
Catherine as weak-minded, and they think that they can almost convince herself that she does like him just by like telling her that she's been leading him on. And it's like, it's so horrible. I hate it, I really do. So John is my definite least favourite, with Isabella as like a close second.
Yeah, I do
because
agree.
I just think they're both so manipulative and yeah, just horrible. But then favourite, I would say Catherine. Because I personally, though I've like made fun of her, like obsession with the Gothic and everything, I think I found it so funny this time because I could see myself at that age in her. Like when I was 18 and I went to university to do English literature purely because I loved Frankenstein so much, and I just like could see that like obsession with books and like the way that you can get taken away by the like just like the fantasy of it all, and how you can like paint these pictures in your head and then reality never lives up to that because you're like so obsessed with like a fictional version of the world. And I just think she's so relatable to probably a lot of book lovers, whether you like the Gothic or not. I think if you like fiction of any kind, you can kind of see that ability to get lost and swept up in a fictional world and to kind of like romanticize reality. And I just found her very relatable for that sense.
I did like Catherine. I think my favourite character just came out of how I felt for him in the situation, and it's Catherine's brother.
James.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Because I think the letter he writes Catherine near the end explaining everything, I just felt sorry for him because you could tell how both him and Catherine had been manipulated by John and Isabella. And I think it was just a really sad situation. Because even in that situation, Catherine was still also being manipulated. But I just really felt for James. Like, I think in that letter, I was just like, I want to give you a hug, you know?
Yeah, I know what you mean, because I think he was a nice character, and he said such nice things to Catherine. He's like, "You're my best friend."
Yeah, he just didn't really do anything wrong. Like, it was just kind of.
In a way, I was glad that it happened because
he definitely deserved better.
You, as the reader, obviously know that Isabella is not nice, so you don't want them to end up together. But it's just a shame that it had to happen at his like expense, if that makes sense. So yeah, I did like James. Okay, relatable. The pump room was my least favorite character. Not the pump room. Does anyone actually know what a pump room is?
I have no idea, but every time I read it,
I'm gonna have to Google it.
I was like, this is not. I don't think it's what I think it is.
What do you think it is?
Oh no, it's not appropriate for me to say.
What
is it? Literally where in terms of, well, no, Jane Austen wasn't at the time of water powered houses.
So I think it actually is a specific place, and it was a meeting place for fashionable people. So I don't know what that means.
Yeah, well, that reminds me of
Bridgerton, yeah. I just feel like it was very confusing because I don't think I've ever seen it mentioned in any of her other novels.
No, this is the thing. I thought it was a very selective thing to Northanger Abbey.
Yeah, and then suddenly every other sentence is pump room this, pump room that.
But it's interesting that if it's for where the higher class of people, where they go, the fact it's not mentioned in Emma.
But I wonder if that's because Emma isn't really out in society. She's like a country girl, and she's just from her like small community. Whereas that is like it said it was in Bath, so I guess that might be like specific to Catherine being actually out in society. Whereas when we think about all of her other novels, it's always like small communities and like people hosting balls at their houses, but it's never really going out like in town, I guess.
I do love the bit in the books now when they first went to Bath and there were so many people there. I thought that was quite a nice a nice opener to the book, because also this one starts off quite like straight away. You don't really have the
preamble,
the 10 pages where Jane Austen's just setting up everybody. This one was straight in, and then suddenly she's in Bath.
Yeah, I did keep intending to Google it throughout, and then I was like, I just don't know. So it's a bit confusing. Someone says, place for people to socialise instead of house parties. Possibly, I think that's probably it. Meeting room. Oh, it's mentioned in Persuasion as well. Interesting. Yeah, I have no idea. But I'm glad that we're all on the same page and that no one knows what it is. So we'll just make a guess that it was. I think it's interesting because obviously, like they mentioned things like the theatre, and we obviously know what that is, or like a party or a ball, and you know what that is. But this is like the pump room.
I'm trying to think if it was a version of public houses, because obviously public houses, I don't know if women were allowed to go to them.
Oh.
So I don't know if, because I know that in society in that time there was a place where women weren't allowed. I don't know if it was coffee houses or public houses where women weren't allowed to go, like it wasn't deemed socially acceptable. So I don't know if that's then a place where,
as a woman, not to be allowed in a coffee house would be shocking.
I think it is something to do with that when they first came about, because in all the pictures and the paintings that you see, I'm sure it's on there.
That's interesting. I do seem to think, now that you mentioned it, that there's a discussion in one of Oscar Wilde's comedy plays which talks about coffee houses, and I think that they're different to what a coffee house is now.
Yeah, they're not
like Starbucks.
No, it's not Cafe Nero. Yeah, originally that's where the men would meet, like a pub now.
Yeah.
So I'm sure it's where women weren't allowed. So maybe that's what the pump room was. For. It provided a place for women
to go.
Yeah.
Interesting. Well, certainly something to look into. It's intriguing, I think, because it was so unavoidable. Like it was in almost every chapter in some sense. So interesting to discuss what it was. Hello. And place to drink the water. Oh, like a water pump.
Well, I did suggest that power.
Interesting. Very fashionable to go and meet people. Nice. Love that for them. Okay, so I feel like we've gone all over the place, but maybe one thing to discuss, we're obviously talking about the pump room and Bath. This book is like not entirely, but somewhat distinctly sort of split into two sections, one taking place in society in Bath and then the other back at Northanger Abbey. And I think that Catherine is kind of like a different person in both locations. So it's interesting. So like in Bath, she's obviously out in society and she's trying to like mingle around. She's living like the socialization of the situation. And she's also, I think, got like a kindred spirit in Isabella in a sense, who like also is kind of like dramatic and likes to like make things bigger than they really are. And then of course she goes off to Northanger Abbey, and there she is like the imaginative, like sort of outgoing one, and she's surrounded by quite subdued people. And I think it's interesting to see how like active her imagination is, and how she manages to let it kind of like take her away when she doesn't really have anything else to amuse her. I feel like she really goes wild with imagination because she's got like very quiet people around, so she's not like got anyone else to like sort of bounce off of as much.
Yeah, and I feel like she needs to, her imagination needs to go so wild, because Northanger Abbey was so anticlimactic. Like, you think it's going to be this great place. Like, I had in my mind in Jane Eyre, when Jane first goes to Mr. Rochester's house and everything, that's what I assumed it would be like, and then you swiftly learn that it's got carpets and it's not what it is. And I think to maybe mask the disappointment of it, she has to imagine that there's all this sort of sordid stuff going on. There's all this history where people have killed people and everything's happening. And I think she needs that, because it's just done a complete 360, and now she's stuck there with people who she does know, but I don't think she really has gotten to know them properly enough in comparison with knowing Isabella and stuff in the first book. So I think she needs to have something to cling on to, because it is just so completely anticlimactic.
For me, and I know you've not seen this, but I don't know if anyone else watching will have, but I recently rewatched the BBC miniseries of War and Peace, and in that we have a subgroup of characters who are Prince Bolkonsky, and then his son Prince Andrei, and then his daughter Princess Maria, and then there is also the introduction of Natasha Rostova, who is like a very like outgoing, gregarious character. She's like very personable. And then the Prince Bolkonsky is very grouchy. And then his daughter Maria, she's really lovely, but she's also very like subdued and introverted and like very like mellow. And it's interesting to see that like dynamic where you've got someone who is like very like sort of outgoing and like loves drama, and not like to be a dramatic person, but just loves like excitement. And I think Natasha and Catherine kind of have that, and it's interesting to see how they respond to being placed in a much more mellow and a bit more like tense of an environment. And I definitely noticed kind of like a bit of similarity there between those two stories. But yeah, I personally think the funniest part of the novel when she was at Northanger Abbey. So first of all, the bit where she was like so excited about the fact that it was an abbey, and she was saying something along the lines of, with all the chances against her of house, hall, palace, park, court, and cottage, Northanger turned out an abbey, and she was to be its inhabitant. And she was just so excited, not really by the prospect of like going to visit her friends, but by the fact that it was just called an abbey and what that represented to her. And like you said, it obviously didn't live up to those expectations, so she had to add the Gothic drama to the situation.
It was when Jane Austen said it had carpets, and I just thought, oh crap.
Poor Catherine. She'd be so disappointed.
Yeah, the carpets.
Yeah, and she just like needs the drama, and if the setting doesn't live up to it, she will create that storyline. And so she's then going off and accusing her host, the general, of murdering his like wife who passed away. And I just thought the way that she like really convinced herself that she was like under the roof of a murderer, so much so that she was going to like tell his son about it, and then the absolute embarrassment that she felt when he was like, no, not true, didn't happen, you're crazy. I loved it so much. I think it was like the peak comedy of this novel, because it's just so brutal. Like, she was like so convinced and then just like brutally taken down by reality.
I felt so much secondhand embarrassment from that situation. And when I can't remember what question she asked, but she asked him another question when he was explaining. He was just kind of like, what are you talking about?
Yeah. And it was like, it was so inconceivable to everyone else that it was kind of like wild how much she convinced herself that it was true without any evidence really.
Yeah, because there was actually nothing there.
It was just that he was like a grumpy old man.
Yeah.
And she's like, murderer. And like, I just thought it was so funny because it was so out there, and yet she was like absolutely attached to her storyline that she had created, and I just loved it because it was really, really funny. And like, I have not ever accused someone of being a murderer, but I think we could all think of an example of where you've like misread a situation and you say something and then someone else is like, wait, what are you on about? And like, even if it's just something really small, like you've just misheard someone and respond to the wrong thing, I personally, you get like a stomach drop and you feel so embarrassed about having gotten the situation wrong, that to realize that you'd accidentally accuse someone of murder, like imagine how bad you'd feel and just how embarrassed you would be to know that you were living with that person. Like,
especially because at this point, when she's talking to Henry about it, she likes Henry at this point.
Yeah.
And she just made a tit of herself, really.
It's just so funny, and I do agree. It's even funnier when you say it out loud, because you have to think, now she was young, she was only 18, but also like at 18 years old, I'm fairly certain that I wouldn't have gone around just like randomly accusing anyone of murder. So like, the fact that she thought it again, built out the story, told herself it in her head, and thought, yeah, that's true. It's just hilarious, like, because she was so misled and maybe like so sheltered, like she just hasn't experienced enough of the real world and has experienced significantly more of a fictional world, that like that led her mind rather than reality and reason.
Yeah, it was kind of like, I've read it in books, so of course
it must be true.
It must be true. It's kind of like I saw it on Facebook, so yeah, it obviously happened.
Yeah, but I do like this. It does kind of even out when she realizes that he was so money obsessed. But still, I would still feel a smidge bad about accusing him of murder. But yeah, I absolutely love it, and it is just like, I think that is like where it all comes together, and you sort of see what Jane Austen has been doing with her like little subtle digs at the like Gothic tropes, and it's like, okay, this is what happens when you become too obsessed with the Gothic. You've no real reason and reality anymore, and you think everything is about murder and about morality, and everyone has like an ulterior motive. And I just think I think it played out really, really funny. I also think, thinking about the humour of the novel, the fact that it is a very short one and we just have like a very like quick paced plot adds to the humour, because there's just like constant subtle digs and descriptions of characters and lots of like misunderstandings that I think it just like plays out as probably one of her funniest novels. Especially if you go in expecting it to be funny, not expecting it to be a serious novel.
I did laugh at certain points, like at the end when they basically waited until General Tully was in a good mood to basically say, we want to get married. Like, they hung on for, wasn't it like a few months or something?
So, yeah.
Like, and that at that time was quite
because things move fast then.
Yeah, so to wait for that long,
yeah,
it was just a bit.
Yeah. What did you think about the romance?
It wasn't my favourite one. I feel like it was a bit, I don't know, I don't want to say it wasn't believable, but I just think I feel like it could have been explored more. I think there was a lot more focus on Catherine and John and Isabella and James and that whole situation. Like, I felt more involved in the situation with James, Isabella, and what's his face? The other Frederick, than Catherine and Henry.
Interesting. I do think, again, her like immediate like love of Henry upon sight basically also kind of adds to her like youthfulness and her obsession with literature, because I guess again it's like that like trope, you know, the love at first sight situation, and just like she sees this guy, he seems nice, and therefore he's the one that she wants to marry. Kind of like shows how I guess like pliable her mind was, and that she could just kind of like talk herself into it, because it seems like a, a like it seems like something that would happen in a book, and therefore she like wanted to go along with it. But I do think that as it went on, she definitely saw him as a more admirable character, and therefore like something good to aim towards. And I think it's interesting that we have Catherine as like the central point of two men's interests, and she is obviously only interested in one of them. But we have John on one hand, who's just like horrible, as we've discussed, manipulative, and just really like not a nice guy. And then on the other hand, we have Henry, who's far less involved, and therefore there's a bit of that like wanting what you maybe can't have situation that kind of lures Catherine towards him. And then also just like he seems much nicer. And there are even like subtle conversations where, you know, John talks about literature and fiction and says that it's kind of like a waste of time and he wouldn't bother reading any books. Meanwhile, Henry says any man or woman who can't find joy in a fictional novel is an absolute idiot. And you just have like these little things that you can see how they would tip the scales in favor of Henry, and just like add to the immediate, like I suppose, the attraction and the idea of him that Catherine fell in love with. And then gradually like the bits of his character that she gets to know, I think add that to the narrative and kind of like sell him entirely to her, if that makes sense. I liked them as a couple. I didn't dislike them. The only Jane Austen pairing that I've ever disliked was the one from Mansfield Park. I won't give any spoilers in case anyone hasn't read it, but it gave me the ick. So
interesting.
That's all I'll say on that one. So I've not disliked any pairing in a Jane Austen novel, but I don't, like you say, I don't think this was my favourite, but it also wasn't my least favourite for sure. Okay, so that's interesting. Yeah, so she behaved off her instinct, being blatantly no to John and then running around to Henry to explain things. Yeah, I do think, you know, despite in certain ways, like being a bit more like, I guess other people are interpreting her as like weak-minded, like we said, the thoughts, they constantly try to like manipulate Catherine. And then of course we see that her mind is like young and easily influenced by novels, but in certain areas, especially in terms of what she views as being right and wrong, we actually saw her as like a very strong character who was willing to stand up for what she believed in. And, you know, like she was willing to say no to John, or if he tried to manipulate her and go off and do something on her behalf, then she would like go and right that wrong, because she didn't want other people to view her badly. And she also wasn't willing to let herself be manipulated. And I think the difference in how John and Henry treat her maybe gave her that level of confidence as well to say no to John, because she recognised that there were better options out there, which I really liked. And I think considering that she was so young, 18, and also, as we discussed at the beginning, not super rich, or, you know, like she didn't have like the amount of prospects of Emma, so she was going to have to get married at some point, but she was willing to kind of stand up for like her beliefs. So I liked that about her. On the contrary, like we have John and Henry kind of like opposing one another, I think we see, you know, an opposition between Isabella and Eleanor as like very, very different young ladies. And I do think Isabella is a lost cause in the way that Austen writes her. Like that's how like she was meant to be. And I think she kind of gets her comeuppance by ending up with no one, essentially. And I think it kind of shows that you can't just try and manipulate everyone around you to try and get like the best circumstance. And I think with Catherine, we see that she was led by her instincts and also by her heart, and going for who she believed that she should be with, and all things worked well for her. Whereas for Isabella, she was like, right, I'm going to get this one guy, but then I'm going to see if I can get something better, and then if I can, I'll go for the better. If not, I'll stick with the original. And by trying to sort of like juggle too many plates and play the field, she ends up with no one. And I think that is kind of like what it shows, is that you shouldn't go for, I guess you shouldn't try and like use people as like societal leverage, and instead you should go for like what your heart really wants. And by not doing that, you end up sort of screwing yourself over, essentially.
Jane often leave characters, like women, female characters, on their own at the end. Like normally every character has...
Yeah, that's true. Like even ones that have made the wrong choice and married the wrong guy and have to suffer the consequences of an unhappy marriage, like we see with a certain character in Pride and Prejudice. I do think that, yeah, she has at least married them off, but I think she made Isabella so unlikable that it was like, sucks to be her because she's never going to get married, basically.
I liked how in the book, in Northanger Abbey, when Isabella sent that letter and Catherine realised that she wasn't actually a nice person, she was like, you know what, Eleanor's going to be my best friend now. I've moved on.
I've moved on, and I'm not even going to reply to her letter. I like that she was just like cutting you off.
She's like, found a new best friend.
See you later. But yeah, I do think she got her comeuppance. And actually, not necessarily just with Isabella, but in general, I think although this is her shortest novel, she gives some quite satisfying character arcs, and we kind of get to see characters in how like Catherine immediately perceived them. She obviously liked Isabella, and then like gradually you get to see their true colours, and I think everyone gets like a satisfying conclusion that's worthy of who they were throughout the novel. So I liked that. Okay, fun one. Who is your favourite Austen couple? So just FYI, because obviously I guess there's possibly spoilers if you haven't read any of her other novels, so maybe just like close your ears if you don't want any spoilers. But for me, it would be Emma and Mr. Knightley, because I love them as a couple, but I also love that they like have a really like banterous relationship, and they will like critique each other, and they constantly, especially Mr. Knightley for Emma, makes her be a better person. And I think it was like a friendship that blossomed into a long-term partnership, and it's one that you could see growing throughout the novel, and it was like a very organic evolution of a relationship, which I think made me really like it, because it wasn't just like I'm looking for a husband, this is the guy I'm going for. It was like really natural and just like slow burn, and I loved it.
Right, mine. Who? I've forgotten his name. Who in Sense and Sensibility did Eleanor marry?
Edward Ferrars.
That's it. Those two.
Yeah.
I think I just loved them too, because I find with certain couples and with certain characters, one of them always annoys me a bit too much. Or like, as much as I love Emma, Emma and Mr. Knightley, I just feel like the age gap and the creepiness.
I just tried to think about the movie version where they look like they're about the same age, and I'm like, oh, that's nice.
Because in the book, it just, if you think about it too long, it's just a bit weird.
It is, but then also there is the context of the time, and it was normal then, but at the same time it is a bit gross. But then in my head they're like normal age. So yeah, Eleanor and Edward Ferrars. I like them because I do think that there is like a miscommunication, and it's like everything. Oh God. I don't think I can. There is like this
Stop it.
miscommunication where you think everything's going one way, and then everything goes wrong, and then it all rights itself in the end. And I do love how Jane Austen, she likes to take you on a roller coaster with her couples, and I think that is like a satisfying and like happy ending. So I do like them. Of course, there's Lizzie and Mr. Darcy, and I think like Emma and Mr. Knightley, Lizzie and Mr. Darcy have that like bantery relationship where it's not like all lovey-dovey. There's like a bit more like depth to the relationship, so love that. Emma and Knightley, love that as a second place for sure. Marianne and Colonel Brandon. Close your ears for this next one.
I've already read it.
Why did you read it?
Because I was just reading it.
Okay.
Don't tell me
Elliot
what book
and
it's
Catherine
from.
Wentworth.
I feel like it would be obvious though when I.
Well, the thing is, actually, I don't think it's too much of a spoiler. So,
I don't even know what book we're talking about at this point.
Anyway, so we've got quite a range there. We're kind of covering all bases except for Mansfield Park, which I think we can all agree was a bust and the romance is wrong and should never have been written. But anyway, that's just me.
I think I'm going to read this before Persuasion, and then so I can rank them.
It's quite a big one, you know. But actually, that would be nice because then we can. Sarah is joining me as well for Persuasion's live show, so we can do a full and final ranking.
Yeah, I'll read it. I'll.
To be fair, it didn't take me too long to read it, and I didn't like it. So you know, it's
okay. I have a free schedule. I'll pencil it in.
Don't pencil it in. Pen it in, and you can't get out of it.
God.
Okay, so we've talked about Bath, we've talked about Northanger Abbey, I think we've talked about most of the characters. So all that's left to talk about is just the way that this book ends. And I actually think, by comparison to some of her other novels that end like very abruptly, there is a bit more of a like romancy bit towards the end, and like a bit of a courtship, and of like asking for the hand in marriage. And you know, I think it does taper off a bit more naturally than some of the other ones, which I think my main critique of a lot of Jane Austen's novels is that they're so full and you get such a good insight into the characters, and then it's just like, and then they were married at the end, and I just like, I feel like there's just lacking in a conclusion. And obviously she never wrote follow-ups or anything like that, so it just feels like, to be so invested in this couple and you want them to get together, to kind of only see up to the point of them getting together and then nothing else always feels a bit disappointing to me. And that is the case in this book as well. We don't see like into their future, but I do feel like it felt a bit more like expansive at the end, maybe.
Yeah. And I think Austen kind of highlighted more how, you know, she's not a one-trick pony, is that the right phrase?
Mm-hmm.
Like how the book doesn't just have to end there, and just because two people want to get married doesn't mean that the parents approve, which is, I think, is something she explores in her other books, like in Pride and Prejudice and stuff.
Yeah.
But like, it shows the difficulty in two people wanting to get married but having to be respectful of the parents and waiting and stuff like that, which I thought was quite an interesting dynamic. You don't often actually see that anywhere else.
No, and obviously, like, we see, obviously, Henry asks for Catherine's parents' permission, and they're like, yeah, we're happy, but we can't go against your dad, so we have to wait for him to agree to it. And I feel like it kind of shows like the logistics and takes out, like, obviously it's a romance novel, but it tries to bring a sense of like reality to it, and it kind of grounds it down again, because it's like, okay, there is all of this like wonderful romance that sweeps up the main characters, but also there is like a reality to the situation, and we have to practically like go through the process of getting married. So
it's quite an interesting contrast, considering that Catherine spent most of the novel in her own
little world,
fantasy world, and then she's dealt with the fact that she needs to just get a grip, and actually, like, it's not like it is done in the books. Like, it has to actually work at stuff. You know?
Yeah. No, unfortunately. So in Austen's works that show how married life suited the protagonist, no, never does. It literally always gets to the point of marriage and then goes no further. So I guess we're just left to assume that they live happy lives. But equally, a lot of the married characters in Jane Austen's novels, so like the adults who are married, never seem like that happy. Like, they don't seem like that connected. The husband is always like one way and the wife is always the other. So whether that's like the wife is like a judgmental busybody and then the husband is like the jovial one, or the husband is like absent and working and the wife is kind of like in the family, like we see that in varying degrees. Or we see, you know, like newer married couples like the Eltons in Emma, who you know, just seem like they're not like entirely happy, but they're trying to live up to this like perception of happiness. But actually, like, she doesn't really show marriage, like married life, in that much glory, whereas
it's all
she
kind of like they just tolerate each other.
yeah, and like often seem to live quite separate lives. Whereas she shows courtship in like a really romanticized way, but actually she never goes into marriage for her main characters. Always just they get married and that's it, and we assume a happy ending. But when you think a little deeper, the images of marriage that she actually shows are not that pretty. So it's
Austen never got married either.
no, she never did. So obviously, a theory that I think was discussed in one of our other live shows was that perhaps she only showed courtship because that was the only experience that she could personally draw on, whereas marriage she could only really view from an outsider's perspective. And so maybe that's why she could show what she had like maybe like observed in married couples, but she never had any insight into it. Whereas like courtship, I think she might have been engaged and called it off. I'm sure.
I think she was engaged.
So like she had that insight into what courtship was and being a young lady out in society, but she never saw what marriage was like from the inside, and that potentially is why she never discussed it. I'm not going to lie, I don't know, so I don't want to say yes or no one way or the other, because although I'm a big fan of Jane Austen, I feel like I've only really gotten into her works more deeply this year when I've been like rereading them. So I'd love to know more about that in the future, and I'm sure there are some people who have definitely talked about that. But I do think that there is probably at least some personal experience gone into it, just in like what she will have observed and seen. You know, this was a time when you couldn't Google things. So like, you know, it wasn't like she could just like look up what was it like in court. You know, she had to have experienced it to an extent to give that insight. So I think somewhat autobiographical in like little snippets, but I don't know if any of her characters were like directly based on her life. It's a short engagement because she wasn't in love, and not like an official engagement. But yes, I think what I'm saying there is just that she had experience of romance and of courtship, but not of marriage.
I think there was definitely somebody on the scene.
Mm.
Can't remember his name.
Yeah.
But I think there definitely was somebody there.
Well, that's interesting. Obviously, we'll talk more about this next time, but a lot of critics say that Anne, she's the protagonist from Persuasion, is like Austen herself, and Anne is a bit older than a lot of Jane Austen's other protagonists. And potentially that, you know, obviously it was her last novel that was published. Obviously it was published posthumously as well, like Northanger Abbey was. But if she wrote that one last as well, it will have been when she was at that oldest point in her life and obviously still wasn't married. So maybe she had like a different perspective there on romance and was maybe a bit more jaded at that point. Whereas in her ones that she wrote when she was a bit younger, she might have been a bit more like young and romantic in her mind. So yeah, interesting. Okay, well, if anyone has any other questions, let me know right now and we'll get to them before we finish up. But I think for me, that's probably bringing Northanger Abbey to a close. I personally, I know I said that I would rate this as my second favourite Austen. Just wanted to mention as well that I actually gave this one 5 stars this time around, because I just found it really fun and I appreciated the humour, and I think it achieved what it set out to achieve so well. It was very well executed, and I really related to Catherine as a protagonist. So I gave it 5 stars, and it is the only, aside from Emma, it's the only one that I've given 5 stars. The rest have been like a mixture of 4 and 3. So I just wanted to put that out there because I do love Jane Austen's novels, but other ones I've always had like little critiques here and there, but I think this one was like very complete. It was short, but it did everything so well, and I really liked it. So that's what I rated it. You don't really rate, do you?
I don't rate books. I will say I do need to give it a reread. Like, it's one that I acknowledge that if I was going to reread any Jane Austen's now, I definitely say I need to reread this one.
Yeah. Oh, okay, one final question. What do you think of Mr. Tilney as a hero? Interesting. Okay, so I I don't know, aside from this book where it obviously says that Jane Austen, she wouldn't view Catherine as a heroine, I'd never think of her characters as heroes or heroines, not in the same way as in the Bronte novels, and I think that's like the distinction of like a romance versus like a drama or a Gothic novel, is that I view them just as like people and you kind of just like viewing their lives. So I wouldn't view Mr. Tilney as a hero as such, but I do think he's like a good chivalrous gentleman, and he's like, I enjoyed watching him as a character, but I don't view him as a hero as such. If that makes sense.
I'd say he's all right, but
he was nice.
I don't think he does anything enough or helps out enough.
No.
To
I also think that like we don't really see him much in his own right.
Yeah, it's a lot more dimension through
Catherine and through her perception and potentially of like how she wants to see him, rather than like who he actually is and kind of showing his true colours. Whereas I think John, we see more of like his true character, whereas Catherine is maybe looking at Henry a little bit more through like rose-tinted glasses. So I think she views him as the hero, whereas as readers, we just kind of see him as like a decent man, but like nothing particularly special.
Whereas John's quite, it's just, she kind of just describes him as how he is, because she doesn't see him as anything else. Like she doesn't even really see him as quite manipulative in the beginning, I don't think. She just kind of sees him as just maybe just a bit annoying. And not really understanding herself how to say no. She doesn't want to go for a ride in a carriage and stuff like that.
And then I think as it goes on, she's like, right, I'm going to put my foot down because I'm not just going to be taken for a ride by you. So yeah, interesting. Okay, I realised I missed this question from a little bit earlier, which is just to say, how often do I do read-alongs? And sadly, you missed reading Northanger Abbey. I'm really sorry about that. But this one has been for the All About Austen read-along, where I was reading Austen's novels in publication order. So we started in August with Sense and Sensibility, and then the last one is going to be next month, and that is Persuasion. Persuasion is technically the January book, but we're going to be doing the live show for that in like mid-February at some point, date to be determined, but I will share that on the Discord group, which is linked down below, and there you can talk to other people about Jane Austen and her novels. So that is where the All About Austen read-along will be ending as soon as we finish Persuasion, very sadly. But I definitely am going to be doing more read-alongs throughout the year, particularly of like classics, because I do think that they are really fun to discuss with other people, and whether you are like a veteran classic reader or someone who's like newer to the genre, I do think having people to discuss them with can make them just that little bit less daunting. And also like there's often so many layers to classics, and they are more pointed in like the like criticisms of society and the like things that they're trying to explore. Like they're often a little bit more specific, and I think different people notice different things, and through talking about the book to other people, you can start to understand what it's meant to be doing, and I think then you start to appreciate it more. So like now you can go into Northanger Abbey and be like, okay, I'm like a bit more aware of what it's like. And I think for me that happened with doing Pride and Prejudice again. I like appreciated what it was trying to achieve a lot more. So I definitely want to do more read-alongs, that is to say. Probably won't be doing them every month, but possibly like every other month after we finish Jane Austen, and I'll be absolutely up for any like requests of books that you want us to do, because I do think they're so much fun. So yeah, okay, so I think that's probably all we need to say about Northanger Abbey. We've said plenty about books to say that it's quite short, and I've really enjoyed this discussion. So as I mentioned, next month's book, or rather this month's book, is Persuasion, the last Jane Austen novel, and we'll be discussing that at some point in February. So I look forward to seeing you all then, but thank you so much for joining us this time round, and we'll see you next time.